If you drank in Quebec in the 1960s, you drank Dow. It came as La Grosse Dow, the big quart bottle sweating on a terry cloth table in a tavern thick with smoke, poured out into little glasses under a tall white collar of foam, the beer your father drank, and his father before him. Behind that glass stood a giant. Dow sold better than half the beer in the whole province, outselling Molson and O'Keefe combined. It had survived the temperance crusades, survived prohibition across the border, survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and a hostile takeover run out of Toronto. And then, in the space of a single spring, the beer that half of Quebec drank became a beer that no one would touch. How does the beer of an entire province vanish in a matter of weeks? What happened? Chapter 1. A Scot on the Little River. The story begins on a small river that most people in Montreal never thought about. The Rivière Saint-Pierre, La Petite Rivière, a modest stream that wound through the low western ground of the city before it was buried under stone and forgotten. In the early years of the 1800s, that ground was one of the few places in Lower Canada where you could brew beer at any scale, because you needed clean water, and you needed a lot of it. And on that river, in a city that was still finding out what it was going to become, a young Scotsman named William Dow went to work in another man's brewery. He was not the founder. That distinction belongs to a man named Thomas Dunn, who had started brewing at La Prairie, across the water from Montreal, back in 1790, a full 3 years before the first stone of anything Dow would ever build. Dunn moved his operation to Notre Dame Street around 1809, and it was there, into that small and hard-working concern, that the Dow name would eventually arrive from Scotland and never quite leave. William Dow was born on the 27th of March, 1800, in Moothill, a village in Perthshire in the Scottish Highlands. His father was a brewer. So was his father before him. The Dows had been making beer in Perthshire since 1652, a family trade running back more than a century and a half before William was even born, through a country where brewing was not a novelty but an inheritance, passed down the way other families pass down a farm or a boat or a name. That is the first thing to understand about him. He did not learn the trade in Canada. He brought it with him, the way a mason brings his hands. When he stepped off the ship into Lower Canada sometime around 1818 or 1819, a young man of 18 or 19, with a head full of malt temperatures and fermentation times, and the particular Scottish patience that good beer demands. He already knew more about brewing than almost anyone in the colony. Montreal had breweries. It did not have many men who had been raised inside the craft since childhood. Dunn hired him as foreman. It was a good match, and a telling one, an established Montreal brewer who needed skill, and a Scottish immigrant who had nothing but skill to offer. Dow was good. He was better than good. And in a colony hungry for competence, being genuinely excellent at a difficult thing was the fastest way up that a man without money could find. By November of 1829, he was a partner. His younger brother Andrew, also trained in the family trade, crossed the Atlantic to join him. 2 Perthshire brewers, working a Montreal riverside, in a business that still had another man's name on the door. That changed in 1834. Thomas Dunn died, and the firm passed into the hands of the men who actually ran it. William and Andrew Dow renamed it, plainly, without ceremony, William Dow and Company. The name that would one day be shouted across 100,000 tavern tables in 2 languages started, as most great names do, as a small legal formality on a document nobody outside the family would have noticed. What Dow built in the decades that followed was not merely a brewery. It was a serious industrial enterprise in a city that was becoming the commercial heart of British North America. Montreal in the middle of the 19th century was the busiest port in the colony, the place where the goods of a continent funneled down the St. Lawrence toward the Atlantic and the mother country beyond it. The other great name in beer belonged to the Molsons, English and established and formidable, who had been brewing since 1786. For William Dow to challenge Molson was not a modest ambition. It was the ambition of a man who intended to win. And he did. By 1863, William Dow and Company was producing roughly 700,000 gallons of beer a year. Molson, in the same year, produced about 142,000. The immigrant foreman had not merely caught the founding family of Canadian brewing. He had passed them by a factor of nearly 5. 2 years before that, in 1861, he had ordered the construction of an enormous new brewery in Griffintown, the crowded, Irish industrial district in the West End, hard against the canal that was turning Montreal into a manufacturing town. It was a statement in brick and timber, a declaration that this was no longer a workshop, but an institution. There is a detail about William Dow that tells you what kind of man had built it. He never married. He lived, by the accounts of the time, baronially, alone in a grand house called Strathern House, at the top of Beaver Hall Hill, one of the finest addresses in the city. But the brewery was only ever part of what he was. He sat on the boards of railways and banks and insurance companies. He had a hand in founding Molson's Bank. A fine irony that the man who had beaten the Molsons at beer would help start the bank that carried their name. He was a director of the Montreal Ocean Steamship Company. He had become, from nothing, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the colony. And then, in 1864, 3 years before Confederation, William Dow did something that almost no founder ever does. He got out. He sold the brewery, the whole concern, the thing he had spent his life building, to a group of associates led by a man named Gilbert Scott for £77,877, a precise, enormous sum. But he made one condition, and it was the condition that would echo for the next 130 years. He kept the name. The buyers could have the buildings, the kettles, the accounts, the trade, but the beer would still be called Dow. The man was stepping away from the business at the height of his powers, 4 years before his own death in 1868. And yet, he arranged things so that his name would outlive not only his involvement, but very nearly everything else about the enterprise. He left an estate worth more than £300,000, not to a wife or a son, for he had neither, but to his late brother's widow and her 4 daughters. William Dow never saw Confederation. He never saw the country that would grow up around his beer. He was gone before the brand was famous, before it was loved, before it became, for a while, the single most important beer in the province of Quebec. He had brewed the beer and left the stage. The name stayed behind to do the rest. Chapter 2. The Paris of the North. To understand how a beer becomes the beer, how a brand stops being a product and starts being a piece of a people's daily life, you have to understand the strange and specific place that Quebec became in the early 20th century, because while the rest of North America was busy trying to make drinking impossible, Quebec quietly decided to remain a place where a working man could have a glass of beer after his shift without apology. This was not an accident. It was a choice, and the province made it deliberately, at exactly the moment everyone else was choosing the opposite. The temperance movement swept across the continent in the years before and after the First World War with the force of a religious revival, which in many ways it was. The United States went dry in 1920. Ontario had already gone dry in 1916 and would not fully reverse course until 1927. Province by province, state by state, the taps were closing across the whole northern half of the continent. Quebec flirted with prohibition too. In 1919, the province adopted a brief ban, but that same year, it put the question to the people in a referendum, and the people of Quebec, in their practical, Catholic, un-Protestant way, decided that beer and cider and wine were not the enemy. Spirits, perhaps, but not beer. By 1921, the province had established the Quebec Liquor Commission, the ancestor of today's SAQ, to regulate a legal trade in a way that treated drinking as an ordinary part of life rather than a moral catastrophe. The consequence was extraordinary. For most of the 1920s, Montreal was the wettest major city in a continent that had gone almost entirely dry. Americans poured across the border by the trainload. The city earned its nickname, the Paris of the North, a place of nightclubs and taverns and jazz, and a robust, unembarrassed drinking culture that ran on beer. And that beer had to come from somewhere. It came, in large part, from a company that had been assembled a decade earlier out of nearly all the province's brewers at once. In 1909, A consolidation swept up something like 14 or 16 of Quebec's breweries into a single enterprise called National Breweries Limited. Dow was in it. So were the makers of Black Horse Ale and Eakers, and the old Boswell Brewery in Quebec City, and a dozen others whose names have largely faded. Only the Molsons, stubborn and independent as ever, stayed out. National Breweries was run for years by a man named Norman Dawes, whose own family brewery had been folded into the Combine, and under his direction it became one of the dominant industrial concerns in the province. It brewed the beer that filled the taverns of the Paris of the North. Dow Ale was one of its flagships. So was King's Beer, a lager, and Black Horse Ale, and the whole business rode the great wave of Quebec's exceptionalism, a province that had looked at prohibition and simply declined. Imagine the tavern in a working-class Montreal neighborhood in those years. It was a room for men. That was the law and the custom both, thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled beer soaked into old wood. The talk was in French, mostly, in the East End, in English in the West, in a dozen immigrant tongues down by the canal where the factories were. A man came in off a 12-hour shift at the rail yards or the docks or one of the great gray mills along the Lachine Canal, and he put down a few coins, and he got a glass of cold beer in a hot room, and for an hour the work fell off his shoulders. That ritual, repeated 10,000 times a day across the province, was the foundation on which Dow would eventually build an empire. Because here is the thing about the tavern trade. It ran on loyalty and habit. A man drank what his father drank, what his friends drank, what the barman put in front of him without being asked. Winning that trade did not happen overnight. It happened over generations, one glass at a time, until a brand stopped being something you chose and became something you simply reached for. Through the Depression, Dow survived. Through a Second World War, when malt and men alike were in short supply, Dow survived. It was one of the fixed points of Quebec life, as reliable as the church bells, as ordinary as the snow. The beer had outlasted temperance. It had outlasted the dry years across the border. It had outlasted the crash of 1929 and the long gray decade that followed. What it had not yet done was become supreme. For that, it would take an outsider, a man from Toronto who had never brewed a drop of beer in his life, but who understood better than almost anyone how to take a collection of good things and make one of them dominant. Chapter 3. The Man Who Made Canada Drink. His name was Edward Plunkett Taylor, and he did not look like a man who would reshape Quebec's most intimate daily habit. He looked like what he was, a Toronto financier, an Ontario Englishman, a builder of empires on paper. But E.P. Taylor understood something about the beer business that the brewers themselves had been slow to see. There were too many breweries in Canada, making too many brands, competing for the same glasses. And a man who could gather them up, shut the weak ones, and pour everything behind the strong ones could own an entire market. Taylor had spent the 1930s and 40s doing exactly that across Ontario, assembling a giant called Canadian Breweries Limited out of dozens of smaller firms. By the early 1950s, he turned his attention east to Quebec, to the great combine that had sat astride the province's beer trade for 40 years. In 1952, Canadian breweries took over national breweries in a hostile takeover, the kind of transaction where the people who run a company wake up one morning to discover that someone else now owns it. It landed in Montreal the way these decisions always seem to land in Quebec, made somewhere else, by someone else, in another language, and arriving as a fact rather than a conversation. A Toronto company now controlled the beer of French Canada. What Taylor's people did next was ruthless, and, in its own cold way, brilliant. They looked at the roster of brands the Combine had accumulated: Black Horse, Boswell, Dow, King's Beer, a whole stable of names with their own histories and their own loyal drinkers. And they made a decision. They would not nurture all of them. They would pick a champion. They picked Dow. The other brands were wound down or pushed to the margins. Boswell, the old Quebec City name with roots on ground where beer had been brewed since the days of New France, faded. Black Horse was allowed to slip. And behind Dow Ale Canadian breweries put the full weight of a modern marketing machine. The advertising budgets, the tavern deals, the relentless, patient work of making one beer the beer. They even renamed the whole group Dow Breweries Limited. So completely did the brand become the identity of the enterprise. It worked beyond anything even Taylor might have predicted. Because Dow had something that no marketing department could manufacture. It was already 140 years old. It already lived in the muscle memory of the province. The Toronto money did not create Dow's dominance. It concentrated it, took a beer that Quebecers already knew and trusted, and removed every reason to reach for anything else. There is an irony here that the men in the Toronto boardroom probably never fully appreciated, and it would matter enormously later. They had taken a brand woven into the fabric of French-Canadian working-class life, and they had made it more central than ever, while owning and controlling it from an English-speaking head office 500 kilometers away. In the 1950s, in a Quebec that had not yet awoken to its own nationalism, that arrangement caused no trouble at all. The beer was Quebecois. The ownership was not. And for a while, nobody thought to ask whether that mattered. For a while. By the end of the decade, the machine Taylor had built was running at full power, and Dow was climbing toward a peak that no Canadian beer had ever reached in a single province. The stage was set for the Golden Age, the years when Dow was not merely popular, but sovereign. Chapter 4. Un Dow pour moi. To have lived in Quebec in the late 1950s and early 1960s was to live inside a world where Dow was simply everywhere, in a way that is almost impossible to imagine now. It was on the radio. It was in the newspapers. It was painted on the sides of buildings and stamped into the metal caps that littered every tavern floor in the province. And it was, above all, in the glass. The cold, amber, foam-topped glass that sat in front of 1 million Quebecers at the end of a working day. The advertising alone was a kind of folk poetry. In English Montreal, the slogan was a small perfect hook. Wouldn't a Dow go good now? You heard it, and you felt thirsty. In French, the campaigns were warmer, more familiar, built for the rhythm of the language. Dites donc Dow. Un Dow pour moi. Dow, plaisir garanti. A Dow for me. Dow, pleasure guaranteed. These were not just advertisements. They were phrases that got into people's mouths, that got repeated as jokes and greetings, that became, the way the best slogans do, part of the way people actually talked. But the genius of Dow's dominance was not in the words. It was in the room. It was in the tavern. Quebec's taverns in these years were an institution as fixed and particular as anything in the province's Catholic culture. They were, by law, for men only. The tavern, distinct from the brasserie, a working man's room where you did not bring your wife, and you did not generally drink anything but beer. And the beer, more often than not, came in the shape that every Quebecer of that generation would remember for the rest of their lives. La Grosse Dow, the Big Dow. The 22-ounce quart bottle, twice the size of the ordinary Chopin, sweating on the terry cloth-covered table, poured out into small glasses, and shared across an afternoon of talk and cards and argument. A man would sit down and hold up 2 fingers to the waiter, and 2 grosses Dow would arrive without another word passing between them. The waiter kept the count with beer caps or pencil marks on the table. Nobody said the brand out loud because nobody needed to. In much of the province, beer meant Dow the way. In another country, a soft drink might mean a single famous name. It had become a generic, the highest and most dangerous honor a brand can achieve. And there was one thing above all that a Quebecer of that era judged his beer by, before he ever tasted it. The head. The collar of white foam standing proud above the rim of the glass. A good Dow arrived crowned with it, thick, creamy, lasting, lacing the sides of the glass as it slowly sank. A flat beer, a beer with a thin and dying head, was something close to an insult, a sign of a careless waiter or a tired keg. In the taverns of Quebec City especially, the men were connoisseurs of foam, and they wanted their collar tall and stubborn and slow to fade. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing a brewer paid attention to, because his customers paid attention to it. Keep the foam right, and you kept the province happy. That small detail, the pride a whole region took in the head of its beer, sat quietly in the background of everything, harmless, a matter of craft and custom. It would not stay harmless. The scale of the operation behind that glass was genuinely large. The Griffintown Brewery in Montreal, the descendant of the great works William Dow had ordered built in 1861, ran day and night, and together with the company's Quebec City plant, employed more than 1,000 people. The place had its own rhythm, the wet heat of the brewhouse where the mash tuns steamed, the cold of the cellars where the beer lagered for weeks in the dark, the endless clatter and hiss of the bottling line where the grosses came off by the tens of thousands, filled and capped and cased and loaded onto trucks that fanned out across the province before dawn. A man who worked that bottling line spent his shift inside a wall of sound, the ring of glass on glass, the thump of the capper, the rush of beer under pressure. A noise so constant that the men learned to read each other's lips and shout the important things twice. The bottles came down the line in an unbroken river, and a good line worker could spot a chipped rim or a short fill at a glance, plucking the bad ones out with a flick of the wrist while the river kept moving. It was skilled work that looked like nothing, the way most skilled work does. And at the end of the shift, the men walked out past the loading docks where the day's beer was already gone, carried off into the Quebec night, and they knew, with the quiet pride of people who make a thing everybody wants, that half the glasses raised in the province that evening would be filled with what they had made. In winter, and in Montreal, winter was half the year, the contrast inside those buildings was its own kind of daily drama. A man walked to the brewery through streets where the snow had been plowed into gray walls, his breath freezing on his collar, and then stepped into the brewhouse where the air was so thick and warm and sweet with malt that his glasses fogged instantly and his coat began to steam. The men who worked the cellars learned to dress for 2 climates in a single shift because that is what the work demanded, and the beer itself was a point of pride. Dow was not cheap swill. It was a competent, respectable, honestly made ale, brewed to a standard that Quebecers trusted precisely because they had trusted it for so long. The company liked to say that Dow innovated and the others followed. Whether or not that was strictly true, the province behaved as though it were. When a Quebecer wanted a beer, the question was rarely which one. The question was how many. There was even, in a sign of just how deep into ordinary life the brand had reached, a cookbook. The celebrated Quebec chef Jeanne Benoit, a household name, the woman who taught a generation of Canadians to cook, produced a little booklet on cooking with Dow, recipes built around the beer, so that it might find its way not just into the tavern, but into the kitchen, into the Sunday roast, into the family table. That is how you know a brand has truly arrived, when it stops being something you drink and becomes something you cook with, something you keep in the house, something as ordinary as flour. Chapter 5. La bière des Canadiens. Français. Numbers can be dry things, but there is one number from these years that, once you understand it, changes how you see everything that came after. At its peak, in the early 1960s, Dow controlled roughly 51% of the entire beer market of the province of Quebec, more than half. One beer, in a province of millions, outselling every other brand combined. In the Quebec City region, the figure climbed even higher, to something near 85%, a dominance so total that it was less a market share than a monopoly of habit. Dow, on its own, outsold Molson and O'Keeffe together. It was, without argument or qualification, the single best-selling beer in Quebec, and Quebec was one of the great beer-drinking societies of the world. To hold half a market that size is not a business achievement. It is a cultural fact. It means that when Quebecers gathered, at the tavern, at the wedding, at the hockey game, at the kitchen table, the beer in front of them was, more likely than not, the same beer. It means a whole society was, in this one small daily way, drinking together. The taverns where that drinking happened were more than places to buy beer. In the working-class quarters of Montreal, Pointe-Saint-Charles, Hochelaga, Saint-Henri, the tight brick streets where the men of the factories and the rail yards and the port lived 3 generations to a triplex, the tavern was an institution as central as the parish church, and rather better attended. It was where you heard about a job, where a man went the day he was laid off and the day his son was born, where the arguments about the Canadians were settled and the news of the neighborhood traveled faster than any newspaper. The waiter knew your name and your order and roughly how much credit you were good for. And the beer that oiled all of it, that sat on 10,000 terry-cloth tables through 10,000 such afternoons, was Dow. The brand was not sold to these men so much as it lived among them. And Dow understood, better than most, how to make that shared habit feel like an identity. The company leaned hard into being not just a Quebec beer, but the Quebec beer, la bière des Canadiens Français, the beer of French Canada. In a province beginning, slowly, to think of itself as a nation, that was a powerful place to stand. Nowhere was this clearer than in the ring. Professional wrestling, la lutte, was in these years one of the most beloved spectacles in French Quebec, a Saturday night ritual broadcast into living rooms across the province, and Dow sponsored it. At its height, la lutte drew something close to 1 in every 2 francophone Quebecers to their television sets on wrestling night, and there, between the throws and the villains and the roar of the forum crowd, was Dow. Its name on the broadcast, its beer in the hands of the men watching, its identity fused with one of the great popular passions of the people it served. The company went further still. As the 1960s opened and a new spirit began to move through Quebec, a stirring of pride and ambition that would soon be called the Quiet Revolution, Dow launched a beer designed to ride the wave directly. They called it Quebec, spelled the modern, phonetic, defiantly French way, and they marketed it as la bière au goût du Québec moderne, the beer with the taste of modern Quebec. It was a striking gamble, a Toronto-owned company selling French-Canadian nationalism back to French Canadians in a bottle, and it captures the central strangeness of Dow at its height. Here was a brand born of a Scottish immigrant, grown inside an English commercial city, consolidated by an Ontario financier, run from an English-speaking head office, and yet beloved, trusted, and claimed as their own by working-class francophone Quebec. The men who drank La Grosse Dow in the taverns of the East End did not think of it as an English beer. They thought of it as their beer. The tension between those two facts, who owned Dow and who loved it, sat quietly beneath the surface, invisible in the good years, waiting. For now, in the good years, there was only the dominance. A beer that had survived temperance and depression and 2 world wars, that had beaten the Molsons at their own game a century before and beaten everyone else since, that filled half the glasses in the province and half the television sets on a Saturday night. If you had stood in a Montreal tavern in 1964 and suggested that within 2 years this beer would be finished, not diminished, not challenged, but finished, its name turned into a curse. The men at the table would have laughed at you and ordered another round. They had every reason to laugh. Dow had never been stronger. And a company that strong, that woven into the life of a people, does not fall. Everyone knew that. Everyone was about to be wrong. Chapter 6. A Gift of Stars. At the very summit of its power, Dow decided to give Montreal a present. Not a beer, a window on the universe. The idea came from the top, from Dr. Pierre Gendron, the chairman of Dow's board, and one of the more remarkable men ever to run a brewery. Gendron was a chemist by training, a founding dean of the science faculty at the University of Ottawa, and an amateur astronomer with a genuine passion for the night sky. He looked at the coming Canadian centennial, the 100th birthday of Confederation, which would fall in 1967, and he imagined something that would outlast any advertising campaign. He imagined a planetarium, and he had the means to build it. In July of 1964, Dow announced the gift. The company would finance a world-class planetarium for the city of Montreal, built at a cost of $1.2 million, an enormous sum, on Chaboyer Square, the site of the old Bonaventure railway station in the heart of downtown. The architects, David, Barat, and Boulva, designed a building whose dome seemed to evoke the rings of Saturn, a low circular temple to the heavens rising out of the gray city. It would be the Dow Planetarium, the first public planetarium in all of Canada. A brewery's name, carried not on a bottle, but on a dome full of stars, given to the people of Montreal as a gesture of belonging. Proof that Dow was not merely selling beer to Quebec, but building things for it. Permanent things. Civic things. The kind of gift that says we are part of this place and we intend to stay. Construction went ahead through 1965 and into the early months of 1966. And on the 1st of April, 1966, the Dow Planetarium was inaugurated. The mayor of Montreal himself, Jean Drapeau, the great showman builder who was even then preparing to give the world Expo 67, presided over the opening. Under the new dome, the projector threw its manufactured heavens across the ceiling, and Montrealers looked up at a sky more perfect than the smoke-hazed one outside, and it bore the name of their beer. It was the proudest moment in the company's history. The peak. 176 years after Thomas Dunn had first set a kettle boiling across the water from Montreal, the enterprise that carried William Dow's name stood at the absolute summit of its power and its public esteem. Half the province's beer, a monument of stars, a mayor at the ribbon. And yet, that spring, as the crews put the final touches on the planetarium's gleaming dome, something was already terribly wrong 300 kilometers downriver, in Quebec City. In the cardiology ward of a Quebec City hospital, doctors had begun to notice a pattern they could not explain. Men, heavy beer drinkers, arriving with hearts that were failing in a strange and sudden and violent way. The pattern had begun the previous August. By that April, it had a body count, though the public did not yet know it and could not yet have imagined the source. The dome opened on the 1st of April. The Quebec City Brewery, though almost nobody understood the connection yet, was shutting down at the very end of that same March. The gift of stars and the coming catastrophe were happening at the same moment, in the same company, under the same name. One in the light of a spring evening in Montreal, the other in a hospital ward downriver, in the dark. Nobody standing under that new dome, looking up at the painted heavens, could have known that they were witnessing not a beginning but an end, that the beer, whose name was written across the stars, had already, without meaning to, begun to kill the people who trusted it most. That is where the story turns. Chapter 7. The Foam and the Detergent. The thing that killed Dow did not begin as a poison. It began as a problem with dishes. By the middle of the 1960s, the taverns of Quebec had modernized their kitchens the way everyone had. They had switched to synthetic detergents to wash the glasses. The new soaps were powerful and efficient and left the glasses gleaming. They also left something behind. An invisible film of surfactant residue clung to the inside of a washed glass, and that residue did something no barman wanted. It killed the foam. Beer poured into a freshly washed glass would rise with a fine head and then collapse, flat and sullen, within seconds. For most beers, in most places, this was a minor annoyance. But recall what a Quebecer, and a Quebec City drinker above all, expected of his beer. He expected the collar. Thick, white, lasting, lacing the glass as it fell. A flat beer was a bad beer, an insult, a sign that something had gone wrong. And now, thanks to a better dish soap, beer after beer was arriving flat on the tables of the province, and the drinkers did not like it, and the brewers heard about it. To understand why a flat beer was a commercial emergency, and not merely a cosmetic one, you have to sit for a moment inside the economics of the tavern. A waiter carried his tray to a table of men, and the first thing those men judged, before they tasted a single drop, was the head. A tall, creamy, lasting collar told them the beer was fresh, well kept, honestly poured. A thin and dying head told them the opposite. In a province where beer meant Dow and every rival was fighting for the same tables, the look of the poor was not a small thing. It was the difference between a table that stayed loyal and a table that began to wonder whether the beer across the street poured better. The brewers were not fussing over vanity. They were defending a habit worth half a market, one glass at a time, and a beer that came up flat in a detergent-filmed glass was a beer that lost tables. Something had to be done, and every brewery in the province felt the same pressure to do it. So the brewers went looking for a fix. And they found one. Not in Quebec, and not alone. Across the industrial world, in the breweries of North America and Europe both, chemists had discovered that a trace of a certain metal salt, added to the beer, would restore and stabilize the head. It would hold the foam up even in a detergent-filmed glass. The salt was cobaltous sulfate, cobalt. It was not a secret compound cooked up in a back room. It was a known additive, patented and distributed by a firm in Copenhagen, A. Jorgensen Laboratories, and sold to breweries as a legitimate solution to a legitimate problem. It worked, it was cheap, and crucially, it came with the blessing of the authorities. In Canada, the Federal Department of National Health and Welfare authorized the use of the cobalt salt from around September of 1964, at a level of roughly 1.2 parts per million. A vanishingly small amount. A trace. Cobalt is not exotic. It is an ordinary metal, the thing that gives certain deep blues their color, an element the human body actually requires in tiny amounts, sitting at the very heart of vitamin B12. Doctors of the day even prescribed cobalt salts as a medicine for certain anemias. So there was nothing about it that should have set off an alarm. A trace of a metal the body used anyway, added at a level the government's own health department had approved, to solve a problem the customers themselves were complaining about. And the drinker at the tavern table never knew it was there. It did not change the taste. It did not cloud the beer, or leave a smell, or alter the color of the pour. It only held the foam up a little longer. There was no label. There was no warning. There was no reason on earth for a single man raising a glass of Dow to imagine that anything at all had changed about the beer he had been drinking his whole life. Understand what that means, because it is the heart of the tragedy, and the reason this story is not a simple one. Adding cobalt to beer was not a rogue act. It was an industry practice, sanctioned by the government's own health department, adopted by breweries on 2 continents to solve a problem the drinkers themselves had created by wanting their foam to last. When Dow's chemists reached for the cobalt, they were not doing something forbidden or strange. They were doing what the industry did. They were following the rules as they had been written. That is the terrible arithmetic at the center of what happened. The people who made this decision were not villains. They were brewers trying to give their customers what their customers wanted, a proper head on a proper beer, using a compound their own regulators had told them was safe. There was no malice in it. There was, if anything, a kind of diligence. And it is precisely that ordinariness, that reasonableness, that makes the whole thing so hard to bear. Catastrophe did not arrive as a crime. It arrived disguised as good service. The cobalt went into the beer to fix the foam, and for a while, for most breweries, in most places, at the permitted dose, nothing terrible happened at all. The trouble at Dow was not that it used cobalt. The trouble was how much. Chapter 8. A trace too much. There were 2 breweries in the Dow Empire, and they were not the same. The Great Works in Griffintown, in Montreal, was the flagship. Enormous, with separate production runs for its draft beer and its bottled beer. But down the river in Quebec City stood the smaller plant, the old Boswell Brewery, built on ground where beer had been made since the days of New France, the very site where the intendant, Jean Talon, had established his Brasserie du Roi, the King's Brewery, back in 1668. 3 centuries of brewing on one patch of Quebec City earth. And it was there, in that smaller and older plant, that the fatal difference was made. At the Quebec City Brewery, a single batch of beer served both the draft lines and the bottles. And into that batch, the brewery added cobalt at a level that ran, by the best reckoning of the doctors who later investigated it, about 10 times higher than the amount used at Montreal. 10 times. Not 10 times the safe recreational dose of some drug. 10 times the amount the same company put in the same beer a few hundred kilometers upriver. Why? The answer takes us all the way back to the tavern glass and the pride in the foam. Quebec City drinkers wanted their collar taller and more stubborn than anyone. It was a matter of regional taste, of local pride, of what a proper beer looked like in that city. More cobalt meant more foam, and more lasting foam, and so the Quebec City plant used more cobalt. The decision that would prove fatal was not a grand strategic blunder made in a boardroom. It was a small technical adjustment made to satisfy a regional preference for a thicker head of foam, the most trivial of motives, carrying the heaviest of consequences. Dow began adding the cobalt in July of 1965, and the single batch mattered more than anyone could have understood at the time. At Montreal, the draft beer and the bottled beer were made on separate production runs, so a heavy hand with the cobalt in one did not necessarily carry into the other. At Quebec City, there was one batch, one brewing, feeding both the bottles that went to the grocery shelves and the kegs that fed the tavern taps, which meant that the tavern regulars, the men who drank draft by the glass, all afternoon, every afternoon, were drinking from the very batch that carried the heaviest dose of all. The brewery had, without the faintest intention of harm, aimed its heaviest hand at precisely the men who drank the most. The people most exposed to the cobalt were the people most devoted to the beer. Even then, the dose alone was not enough to kill an ordinary drinker. This is the second cruel turn in the story. The cobalt in the beer, even at the Quebec City level, an intake that reached perhaps 10 milligrams a day for the heaviest drinkers, was still far below the amounts that doctors of the era gave patients on purpose. Cobalt was used medically to treat certain stubborn anemias, at doses up to 50 milligrams a day, 5 times what the beer delivered, and those patients did not drop dead of heart failure. The cobalt was not a simple poison. It was a trigger that needed an accomplice. Several, in fact. It became lethal only in the presence of a particular and tragic combination. Enormous alcohol consumption, the poor nutrition that so often traveled with it, a shortage of protein and thiamine, and hearts that heavy drinking had already quietly weakened over the years. The cobalt was the last straw laid on a body already carrying too much. These were not reckless young men. They were, for the most part, working men in their 40s and 50s and older, men who had drunk at this pace for years, whose bodies had adapted to it in the way bodies do, whose hearts had been quietly strained long before the cobalt ever arrived. They were regulars. They had names the barman knew, and chairs they always sat in, and a standing order that arrived without a word. Many of them lived on the thin nutrition of men who take too much of the day's calories from a glass, short on the protein and the thiamine that a heart under strain needs most. That was the tragic profile. Not the occasional drinker, who was never in any danger at all, but the most faithful customer, the man for whom the tavern was a second home, and Dow a companion of 30 years. Loyalty was the risk factor. The more a man loved the beer, the more the beer could hurt him. And who carried that combination? The most devoted drinkers. The tavern regulars. The men whose loyalty had built Dow's 51% in the first place. Of the patients who would soon fill the cardiology ward in Quebec City, an astonishing number were drinking on a scale that is hard to picture. More than 200 imperial fluid ounces of beer a day. Nearly 6 liters. Something like 10 pints. Every single day. Day after day. The beer had found its way into the very center of these men's lives. And now the beer, through the smallest of adjustments made for the best of reasons, was going to take those lives. There is one more thing that must be said plainly here, because the story has too often been told as though Dow alone had done something monstrous. It had not. The same additive, at incautious levels, killed heavy drinkers in other cities at almost exactly the same time. In Omaha, Nebraska, 64 patients were admitted to 3 hospitals with the same strange heart failure, and 40 of them died. In Minneapolis, 28 men turned up at a veterans hospital over the same span of years. There were cases in Leuven, in Belgium. This was not a Quebec disease or a Dow disease. It was a cobalt beer disease, and it struck wherever the additive was used too freely and the drinkers drank too hard. Dow's tragedy was not that it invented a poison. It was that its Quebec City brewery, trying to please the most foam-proud drinkers in the province, used the heaviest hand, and its most loyal customers paid for it. There is no real comfort in that distinction. About 20 men were dead, and a beer they had loved and trusted had killed them. That the killing was an accident, that the practice was industry-wide, that it had been blessed by the regulators themselves. None of it lightens a single coffin. It only makes the thing sadder. Chapter 9. The Tiger-Striped Hearts. It started with one man. In August of 1965, a patient came into the cardiology service at Laval University in Quebec City with a heart that was failing, and failing wrong. The doctors had seen alcoholic heart disease before, plenty of it in a hard-drinking province. But this did not behave like the slow, chronic weakening they knew. This was violent and fast. The heart failed on the left side, then gave way to shock. The blood turned acid. Fluid gathered around the heart. The blood thickened strangely, and the thyroid changed in ways that made no sense. These men were not declining. They were crashing, arriving at the hospital, and, in many cases, dying within a day. For a doctor, there are few things more unsettling than a disease you cannot name. Morin and his colleagues were watching men die on a timetable measured in hours, and the textbooks offered no explanation for it. Alcoholic heart disease did not behave this way. Nothing they knew behaved this way. They ran every test they had. They took the histories, careful and complete. They asked about the drinking, and the drinking was always there, enormous, sustained, years of it. But heavy drinking was ordinary in Quebec, and the overwhelming majority of heavy drinkers were not dying like this. Something else was in the room with these men. The doctors could feel it. They simply could not see it. The physician who took hold of the mystery was a young cardiologist named Yves Morin. He and his colleagues at Laval, among them the doctors Foley, Martineau, and Roussel, whose names would go on the paper that made the case famous, began to gather the cases and to search for what tied them together. And the cases kept coming. Through the autumn of 1965 and into the winter and spring of 1966, the ward filled with the same terrible presentation, over and over. The clue, when it came from the dead. On the autopsy table, the hearts of these men told a story the living bodies had not. The muscle of the heart, the myocardium, was not a uniform red. It was striped, pale bands running through the dark tissue, a mottled, streaked appearance that Morin had never seen. He gave it a name that would follow him for the rest of his life, that would become the title of the book he wrote about the affair decades later. Les Cœurs Tigrés, the tiger-striped hearts. The stripes were the visible mark of a muscle that had been poisoned unevenly. Bands of dying tissue running through the living, so that the heart on the table looked, unmistakably, like the hide of a cat. It is not the kind of thing a doctor forgets, but a striking appearance is not the same as an explanation. And for a long and frightening stretch of months, an explanation was exactly what they did not have. The hearts told them that something had killed these men. They did not tell them what. But naming the lesion was not the same as explaining it. At first, no one could. Pathologists in Canada and the United States looked at these striped hearts and did not recognize them. There was, as Morin himself later put it, a genuine element of suspense to the whole affair. It took a great deal of time and effort to find the cause. The doctors were staring at the evidence of a killer without being able to say what the killer was. What a case like this demands is not brilliance so much as stubbornness, the refusal to file the deaths under the easy heading of drink and move on. Morin's series kept growing, and he kept documenting it, patiently, case by case. The presentation, the fulminant course, the findings on the table, all of it set down with the kind of clinical care that would eventually let a doctor 1,000 kilometers away recognize his own patients in the description. That documentation was the thing that saved the investigation. When the paper Morin and his colleagues finally wrote appeared, 48 cases, laid out in exact detail, it gave the strange striped heart a written face. A physician in Nebraska or in Belgium could read it and think, that is precisely what I have been seeing, and I did not know what to call it either. What broke the case open was distance. The same syndrome, the same fast, fatal, tiger-striped heart failure in heavy beer drinkers, was surfacing in Omaha, and in Minneapolis, and across the Atlantic in Leuven. Doctors comparing notes across those far-apart cities began to see the one thing all their patients had in common. It was not the water. It was not the weather. It was not some local contagion. It was the beer, and specifically the cobalt that had lately been added to it. The tiger stripes were the fingerprint of cobalt on a heart already worn down by drink and hunger. Once the doctors saw it, they could not unsee it. The mystery had a name, and the name was in every tavern in the province. The convergence was the proof. 4 cities, thousands of kilometers apart, sharing no common water and no common weather and no possible contagion between them. And yet the same men dying the same fast, striped death. And in every one of those cities, the same recent change. A trace of cobalt lately added to the beer to hold up its foam. Nebraska, Minnesota, Belgium, Quebec. The pattern was too exact to be coincidence, and when the additive was withdrawn, the deaths stopped. The firm in Copenhagen that had patented and sold the compound took it off the market in 1967, and the acute killing form of the disease went with it. The foam that an entire industry had worked so hard to save had been, in the heaviest dosed beer and the heaviest drinking men, quietly and consistently fatal. Now the doctors knew. The question was what would happen when everyone else found out. Chapter 10. La bière qui tue. The story broke in the last week of March, 1966. On the 26th, La Presse ran it. The government was investigating deaths in Quebec City. About 15 people, the paper said, dead in connection with something they had been drinking. Ottawa was looking into it. The story did not yet have the whole shape of the thing, but it had enough. Then the CBC, out of Toronto, named the beer. It named Dow. And a Montreal paper, Montreal Matin, put it on the front page in the biggest and cruelest words the story would ever wear. La bière qui tue, the beer that kills. On the 29th of March, the president of Dow was formally notified that his beer was the subject of a poisoning investigation. On the 30th and 31st, the provincial minister of health, Eric Kierans, made it public. He was careful, more careful than the headlines. He said a Quebec City physician had raised a possible link between very heavy beer consumption and a form of heart disease. He stressed that the brewery had been rigorously inspected and that no contamination had been found. And that, in its own way, was the cruelest wrinkle in the whole affair. The inspectors were not lying, and they had not been careless. There was no contamination, no filth, no spoilage, no rogue bacteria, nothing that a brewery inspection was designed to catch. The cobalt was not a contaminant. It was an approved ingredient, added deliberately, at a level the government's own department had sanctioned. A brewery could pass every inspection in the book, spotless and above reproach, and still be sending out a beer that was killing its most faithful drinkers, because the thing doing the harm was not a lapse in cleanliness. It was a decision, made in good faith, blessed by the rules. And a decision blessed by the rules is not the kind of thing an inspector is sent to look for. But the careful words did not matter. The 3 words on the front page had already done their work. You cannot unring that bell. La bière qui tue was not a phrase a public forgets. It was short enough to remember, terrible enough to repeat, and it fastened itself to the beer the way a burr fastens to wool. It traveled from the front page to the tavern to the kitchen table in a matter of days. Men who had spent their whole lives ordering Dow without a second thought now looked at the bottle differently. They looked at the foam, the very foam they had prized, the collar they had judged a good beer by, and something turned over in them. The thing they had loved about the beer was, it seemed, the thing that had done the harm. A pleasure had become a warning. That same day, Dow acted. It suspended production at the Quebec City Brewery. And it did the thing that it believed would reassure the province, the thing that would prove it had nothing to hide. It recalled the beer. All of it. Over about 10 days, Dow pulled its beer out of the taverns and the hotels and the restaurants and the grocery shelves across the province, and then destroyed it. Something like 390,000 cases, by the counts that survive, along with the beer still sitting in the storage vats. By some reckonings, the volume ran to 2 million liters. It cost the company on the order of $625,000 to pour it all away. Hold the picture of that for a moment. The trucks that had carried the beer out across the province before dawn for decades now ran in reverse, collecting it, hauling it back. The great storage vats at the breweries were drained down to nothing. Beer by the tank, by the truckload, by the hundreds of thousands of cases, gathered up and destroyed in the space of a week and a half. A company does not do a thing like that lightly. It does it when it believes it has no other choice, and it does it in full view of a public that is watching every truck and drawing its own conclusions from the sheer size of the gesture. Where it was poured is, to this day, not entirely settled. The popular telling, the one that got into the English accounts and hardened into legend, is that the beer went into the St. Lawrence River, a great amber tide running out to sea. The more careful French-language sources say something less cinematic, and more likely, that the recalled beer was poured into the sewers of Quebec City. The truth may be lost in the confusion of those 10 frantic days. What is certain is only this. The beer that had filled half the glasses in the province was, all at once, poured down the drain. The recall was meant as reassurance. It was read as a confession. Because why would a company destroy its own beer, millions of liters of it, at enormous cost, unless the beer was guilty? The gesture that was supposed to say we are being careful said, to the ear of a frightened public, we did it. And there was no taking it back. Here is the strangest part, the part that sits uneasily with the legend. No legal proof of causation was ever established. The province never formally declared that Dow's beer had killed anyone. The exact number of the dead was never even fully agreed upon. The early press said about 15. The doctor's own series ran to 48 cases with something close to 20 deaths. Roughly 40% of the men who came through that ward. The precise mechanism, the tangle of cobalt and alcohol and malnutrition and old damage, was understood only later in the medical journals. None of it mattered to the market. Certainty is not what moves a public. Fear is. And the fear was total. Quebecers stopped drinking Dow almost overnight. Not gradually, not with a decent interval, overnight. The beer that had been reached for without a thought, ordered by a raised finger, drunk by half the province, that beer became untouchable. A man who had drunk Dow all his life would not put it to his lips. Molson and O'Keefe, the rivals Dow had once outsold combined, simply divided the abandoned market between them. Picture the tavern in the weeks that followed. The same room, the same terry-cloth tables, the same waiter working the same floor. But the raised fingers now called for something else. A Molson, an O'Keefe, anything at all but the beer whose name had become a headline. The waiters restocked their coolers with the rivals' brands almost as fast as the trucks could bring them, because a tavern that kept pushing Dow would empty out by supper time. A loyalty that had taken generations to build, father to son, chair to chair, one gross Dow at a time, was gone in the time it took to read a newspaper. There is no slower thing on earth to earn than a drinker's trust, and no faster thing to lose. And the timing could hardly have been worse for what Dow represented. The scandal landed at the very height of the Quiet Revolution, in the season when Quebec was remaking its sense of itself. That June, the province went to the polls and turned out the government. The nationalist tide was rising. And here was a beloved beer, claimed as La Bière des Canadiens Français, revealed to have poisoned French-Canadian drinkers, while owned, all along, from an English-speaking head office in Toronto. Nobody had to say the words. The symbolism said them. The dome of the Dow Planetarium had opened on the 1st of April, days after the story broke. A gift of stars from a company that, in the same fortnight, was pouring its poisoned beer into the drains of Quebec City. The grandest gesture and the deepest disgrace, side by side, wearing the same name. The beer that had survived temperance, the Depression, and 2 world wars had not survived a change in dish soap and a regional love of foam. Chapter 11. The Quiet. Under the Dome. Dow did not die all at once, the way its drinkers had. It died slowly, over decades, the name lingering long after the trust was gone. The company was sold to O'Keefe in 1967. The Quebec City Brewery, 3 centuries of brewing on Jean Talon's old ground, closed in 1968 and was largely torn down by 1974. The brand itself limped on, passed along as the corporate ownership shifted, through Canadian breweries and Carling O'Keefe, and finally into Molson when the two merged at the end of the 1980s. And then, in the spring of 1997, Molson quietly discontinued the Dow brand altogether. A name that had been brewed, in one form or another, since 1790, simply stopped. There was no funeral. There was barely a notice. The great brewery in Griffintown, at the corner of Peel and Notre Dame, was abandoned the following year, in 1998. And for a time, it became the kind of place that a story like this one always seems to leave behind. A derelict brick hulk, asbestos in its bones, its windows broken, drawing the urban explorers and the ghost hunters who are always drawn to the ruins of things that mattered. Snow blew through the empty brewhouse where the mashed tuns had steamed. The cellars where the beer had lagered in the dark went colder and darker still. And the people, the more than 1,000 who had worked the brewhouses and the bottling lines and the loading docks, the men who had walked out past those docks at the end of a shift, knowing that half the province would drink what they had made that day. They scattered, the way a workforce scatters when the thing it served goes down. Some caught on with the rivals who had inherited Dow's market. Many did not. Their skill had been poured into a beer that no one would drink, and a name that no one would speak, and overnight that skill was worth almost nothing. This scandal is remembered, rightly, for the men it killed. It ought to be remembered, too, for the men it simply put out of work. Quietly, without a headline, in the long gray aftermath once the story had left the front page and the province had moved on to other beers and other worries. But that is not quite where the story ends, and this is the part that lifts it, a little, out of pure tragedy. The main brewery building did not stay dead. The École de Technologie Supérieure, a French-language engineering school, part of the University of Quebec, took over the old works and made it the heart of a downtown engineering campus. Where beer once flowed, students now study. The dome of the old Dow Planetarium, which drew nearly 6 million visitors before it finally closed in the autumn of 2011, was ceded to that same school. A few years later, it became a home for technology startups, young companies being born under the roof that a brewery built. And on the wall of the old complex, a mural 19,000 square feet across, Ligne du Temps, Lines of Time, now tells the story of what was brewed here, so that the students walking past will know whose ground they stand on. Down in Quebec City, on the Îlot des Palais, the heritage site that sits atop Jean Talon's ancient brewery, they mounted an exhibition about the long history of brewing on that spot. Ici, on brassait de la bière. Here, we brewed beer. And in it, an old man appeared to tell the hardest chapter. Yves Morin himself, the cardiologist, recalling the tiger-striped hearts he had found on the autopsy tables of 1966. Morin's own life turned out well. The young doctor who cracked the mystery went on to become Dean of Medicine at Laval, and later a Senator of Canada. His work outlived the beer that occasioned it. Because the strangest legacy of this whole affair is a medical one. Quebec Beer Drinkers Cardiomyopathy became a landmark case in the study of the heart, taught and studied around the world. And once the cobalt was withdrawn from beer in 1967, the acute, killing form of the disease essentially vanished from the earth. It has scarcely been seen since. The tiger-striped hearts are a closed chapter. The men who bore them are not coming back, but no one else will die the way they died. There is a lesson buried in that, but the eulogist does not reach for it. He only stands in the place and notices what is there. What is there is this: a brewery that once filled half a province's glasses, now full of students bent over their equations. A planetarium's dome, once a brewer's gift of stars, now sheltering companies that did not exist when the beer was poured away. A mural on a wall, telling the time. And somewhere in the memory of the oldest Quebecers, growing fainter every year, the taste of a beer that came crowned with a tall white collar of foam. The foam they loved, the foam that killed them. The gross Dow, sweating on a terry cloth table in a warm room on a cold afternoon, when the beer was the best in the province, and the men who drank it could not imagine a world without it. The world without it came anyway. It came not through war or crash or competition, all of which Dow had beaten. It came through a trace of a metal, added to please the drinkers, in a plant on ground where beer had been made for 300 years. The taverns are gone. The men are gone. The beer is gone. The dome is still there, full of quiet, holding the sky it never really held. A brewer's monument to the stars, standing over a city that has mostly forgotten which beer built it, and what that beer, in the end, cost.